Absolutely. Megan, Stephen, thank you so much for helping us kick off today's Responsive Nonprofit Summit. I'm so grateful for us and our team coming together to make this possible. We have an exciting session coming up in just a moment. As Megan and Stephen mentioned, everything you need is going to be located on the Responsive Nonprofit Summit lobby. So if you need anything throughout the day, you can definitely hit that up. It's filled with sessions, everything that you could think of. It also has support and chat. And we're also grateful that we have a series of collaborators that have helped make today's summit free and accessible to all. That was really important to us. And we had partners like Classy and Pursuant and the We Are for Good community, Community Boost, Raise Donors, help make this happen. And so we're super grateful for that. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next session. We wanted to kick off today's summit by asking the question around why generosity matters. And I'm excited to invite Gabe Cooper to the stage, Kris Putnam-Walkerly to the stage, and Maria Cho. Hey, Gabe, good morning.
Good morning, Noah.
Hello.
Hi, Kris. Hi, Maria.
Hey, Noah. Hi.
I'm so grateful that you guys are a part of this session this morning. We wanted to start here because we think it's really important. You know, Gabe, Virtuous is missioned to really focus on helping nonprofit teams grow generosity. And we ask this question a lot. How do we help grow generosity? How do we think about that? So we'll be definitely getting into that. But before we do, I want to introduce our other two panelists, Kris and Maria. Kris, you're a global philanthropy advisor at Putnam Consulting. And then Maria, you're the CEO and founder at Raise for Good. Thank you all so much for being here.
Absolutely.
Gabe, I'll kick it over to you to start this session off. You know, we said it's all about generosity. Why does generosity matter? That's the big question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it matters for a couple of reasons. One is that the amazing organizations we support have the ability to create good in the world that just aren't going to get created by the free market or government. We're in a particular place and time where we can solve some of the world's biggest challenges through the generosity of our donors and people in our community. But I think maybe just as importantly is that generosity has the power to shape the heart of the donor. So I don't know if you guys have watched the news much lately, but it seems like people can be a bit self-interested or selfish. And I think generosity has the ability to sort of take us out of ourselves and make us focus on others. It has the ability to shift the heart of the giver to the other, which I think is incredibly powerful. And so I think particularly in the world we're living in today, it's one of the most powerful ways that we can sort of shift the cultural narrative and come together as a community.
Absolutely. And Maria and Kris, I want to get your take. Maria, how would you answer this question? Why does generosity matter?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, given everything that's going on in the world, as Gabe mentioned, there's a lack of access and equity in this world, particularly for women and people of color. So at Raise for Good, we really believe in access to capital is a huge vehicle to create change in the world. So I think when I think about generosity, it's really to ourselves as well. I know there are lots of nonprofit leaders here, and the work that you do every day is really, really difficult. You wear a lot of hats and you carry a lot of burdens. So I actually think it's really about being generous to ourselves in addition to supporting our communities.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. Generosity has a lot of different shapes. And interestingly enough, my kids and I at dinner last night were talking about this, like, what is generosity? What does it mean to be generous? And they asked the question, am I a donor? Can I be a donor? How would I be a donor? Oh, I have been a donor because I volunteered. I've been a part of a kids club, or, oh, I helped my brothers. Like this idea of how generosity can show up in many different ways. And even at our kitchen table last night around that table. So thanks for that, Maria. Kris, what's your take on this? Why does generosity matter?
Yeah, well, I really think about generosity as, freely giving your whole self to whatever you're doing. And so, I advise philanthropists, funders, donors, and from the funders' perspective, philanthropists have more to give than wealth. They have more to give than money. They can freely give their knowledge, their insights. They can make introductions to nonprofit leaders. They can listen to nonprofits, talk about some of the challenges and help brainstorm solutions. There's all kinds of ways that donors and funders can be generous and give that goes way beyond dollars. which of course are important, I do know. But, it matters, I think, because, as we've learned in the past year, we really, truly are all in this together. It takes a global pandemic, perhaps, but literally every human being on the planet was impacted by COVID. And we all need each other to, weather the storm and to get through it and to not just survive and thrive. And if you think about, the individual people in neighborhoods who were providing mutual support to their neighbors, checking in on elderly people, or maybe people with small kids who couldn't get out of the house to get groceries, that's generosity. You think about, the doctors back at the beginning of COVID who were working in hospitals and kind of making up treatments as they went, and posting about it on online forums to share what they were doing and trying and learning to treat COVID with their colleagues just to see if they could be helpful. Their job was to treat people. It wasn't to post about it, but they did because they were generous. One of my clients is the Sierra Health Foundation in Sacramento, California. And interestingly, when COVID hit and then there was the CARES Act funding, the federal government allocated about $180 million to Sacramento County for CARES Act to respond to COVID. Sacramento County's response was to allocate of that 181 million, 146 million to the sheriff's department and probation, not to public health. In fact, public health department's request for $60 million was denied, and they were allocated like 1.2 or something in a public health crisis, right? And so it was the Sierra Health Foundation staff and leadership, along with other people in the community who mobilized, were outraged, and ultimately got 45 million allocated to public health for a public health, pandemic. But the foundation leaders really went above and beyond. They basically had two jobs last year: their day job of, giving money away, and their other job of mobilizing a whole response, like basically creating a public health response to COVID. They became contact tracers. They organized organizations to do, testing and creating testing sites. All of that to me is a fantastic example of generosity. And I just want to echo what Maria said. I really do think generosity starts with ourselves. We have to put our oxygen masks on first before we can take care of others. And as a nonprofit leader, if you're not getting enough sleep and you're exhausted, you can't possibly bring your best self. And as a funder, if you're not investing in your own learning and your own development and advice or coaching and relationship building, then you can't possibly have the greatest impact that you want to have. So I think it really is important.
Yeah, and I think your note about the foundation that gave or kind of rallied that support really brought up something that Maria, you and I had a conversation with about last week around this idea of trust-based philanthropy. Could you unpack that a little bit more for this group and how nonprofit leaders kind of can further advocate for this within their supporter base?
Absolutely. So again, as we think about generosity, it's also to ourselves. And so our philosophy is really, how do we elevate the brand of the nonprofit leader? There's so much expertise and lived experience that you all bring to the work that you do every day. And so when we think about trust-based philanthropy, it's really elevating the expertise of the nonprofit leader, ensuring nonprofit leaders have the support, frankly, and the tools that they need to run effective organizations. So, as we're here today talking about how we can also leverage technology to really accelerate our work together, that's a key tool. And so once the nonprofit leader really goes into that conversation with the confidence and the agency in these funding conversations, I think there's going to be a shift in the power dynamics and how philanthropy works. So with philanthropy, we often talk with our clients and our communities of funders that we partner with to think differently about their own impact. So again, as Kris mentioned, there's a huge education process and continuous learning that needs to take place from the funder's perspective. So who are new communities that you should know about that you don't? How do you think about funding different types of leaders, like leaders of color? Only about 8% of philanthropic dollars get funded to leaders of color. So how can philanthropy think differently? Just like when we look at the startup sector, Companies are raising hundreds of millions of dollars in funding, and they get decades to prove out their business model. And as nonprofit leaders, we get less than a year to actually be able to justify that impact and measure it somehow and make sure we have very low overhead. So really collaborating with funders to really understand the actual challenges that nonprofits face. But also, again, our call to action is to build more capacity for nonprofit leaders, have a longer term investment horizon in your nonprofits. And ultimately, when you do that, you will, as a funder, have more impact yourself.
Yeah, that's helpful context, Maria. And I couldn't agree more. Kris, I know you work with philanthropists and kind of advise them on how to give. So to Maria's point, like, how do you see supporters, funders typically determine when, how, and what they'll support?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would say there really is no one way because, if you've seen one foundation, you've seen one foundation. They're all so different. And if you think even just about like family philanthropy, is that a family that's been philanthropic with a foundation for decades or generations? That's one kind of family. Or is it a family that's recently come into wealth and now they're starting their philanthropic journey? But is that because of a tragic loss of someone and now they've inherited money? So there's all that emotion, or is it because they sold a business? So those are all different starting points and different issues. But, and it's harder to give money away than you might think. I mean, all of you listening and watching, imagine if you had $50 million, like someone just gave it to you and said, hey, be philanthropic with this. And that might seem easy. But then you think about, well, what are the issues that I really care about? And then do you have to involve other family members or other people who might have varying opinions about where that money should go? You care about domestic violence prevention and they care about, I don't know, the, childhood cancer that their best friend's son had and treating that, right? Or the differing political perspectives. And so there's a lot that goes into kind of figuring out how to give. And meanwhile, everyone knows you have $50 million. So now everyone's hitting you up for money, including your friends. So it can be very overwhelming. And it's really not surprising to me that a lot of donors kind of go into hiding. That's their response, is to shut down. And it's unfortunate. But there's so much fear, interestingly, I think, in being a funder. So much so that, I published a book last year called Delusional Altruism. And I think fear and overwhelm are such big problems and barriers to effective giving that I've dedicated 2 chapters on it. It's really a problem. And so I think, what funders should be doing, though, is creating a strategy. If it's, call it a strategic plan, call it a giving plan, but really creating clarity on what you're trying to accomplish as a funder, what kind of impact you want to have in the community, what kind of philanthropic company or family do you want to become, then look at where are you today? And I help my clients do this, literally, where are you today? And what are the 3 or 4 most important things you should focus on next to move you from where you are today to where you want to be, like in a year, not 10 years, like in a year, and then focus on that and get working on that. And that to me is a strategy, but it can feel really daunting, I think, especially in this past year when it feels like the conditions all around us keep changing and the crises keep showing up. It can feel hard for all of us, nonprofits and funders alike, to plan ahead. So I do actually have a free resource I'd love to share with you all. It's a guide that you can download. It's called 8 Things Every Philanthropist Can Do to Change the World, Even When the World Keeps Changing. And it's a free guide to help you think about, like, how do you create a plan, a fundraising plan, a communications plan, a giving plan, strategic plan, even when conditions all around you keep changing, and some steps you can take to make sure that, yes, you can do that, and you can have the confidence that you can change gears along the way. And so if you're interested, and I'd encourage the nonprofits listening, it's equally applicable to you too, you can just pull out your phone and text the word plan 2021 to the number 411321. So just text the word plan 2021 to 411321. And if you're calling in or watching this globally, the number is +1 909 741 1321. And it's a free resource. It's a free download. And I think you'll find it really useful, because I really think that if any of us, business owners, consultants, nonprofit organizations, haven't refreshed our strategy in the past 9 to 12 months, we really need to, because that's what's helping us guide and focus and identify our priorities.
I would also just add, funders, everyone, right? We really need to think about our values. And I think what's really great and what resonated with me with Virtuous is the concept, and we feel this at Raise for Good as well, that change can be joyful. And so again, I just want to emphasize that as nonprofit leaders, as Kris mentioned, funders are overwhelmed, whether they have inherited wealth or have been running a foundation for a long time. The world is constantly changing, and so that's a value that you can bring as nonprofit leaders to funders, and that education process is so critical, and again, a huge value that you can bring to funders.
Yeah, and Maria, I almost want to double tap a little bit from your perspective, because Kris kind of presented it from, this is what funders, or these are what these individuals, both large and I think the everyday donor is not much different as far as like how we think about what's important to us and how we go about that. What should nonprofit leaders take away from that? So like if you're hearing what Kris is saying about how the funders are thinking, what are some practical things that nonprofit leaders should be focused on as they go out and try to cultivate generosity for the causes that they're working on?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's an opportunity. We really focus on the next generation of tech wealth at Raise for Good. So again, we work with a lot of earlier stage nonprofits as well, which I know many are in the room today. So it's really kind of from the ground up, understanding someone's values, their lived experience. There's lots of tech wealth here. And we have, founders or the first 10, 100 employees saying, I don't know how to get started. And so again, as Kris mentioned, when you really think about what you value and kind of where you start, the nonprofit leader is a huge resource. The next thing I will say is, again, we want to see you all go into that room with tons of confidence. You've lived through several pandemics, global pandemics. You're responding to crises every day in the world, frankly. This is unfortunately not something new for a lot of us in the room, especially those in the health and international development areas. So you are an expert, unfortunately, at responding in a crisis. So again, really think about your expertise, and it's a huge value to bring to funders. And second, I will say, have a very clear vision. Really be able to articulate that vision really clearly. We all need to inspire and bring donors along with us. So really developing that compelling vision and story and messaging is a huge piece of the puzzle. And then backing that up with your roadmap on how you're going to achieve that impact and how much that's going to cost. And I will say, just doing the due diligence up front and anticipating the needs of the funder and going into that conversation so they basically can't not fund you because you've answered all their questions before they even thought about them, and you have such a clear path forward, and you're so inspiring and you're educating them that it's really hard to say no.
Yeah, that's great notes. Gabe, you wrote a book last year called Responsive Fundraising, where we kind of talk about some of these items around how you should steward donors or think about working with donors to kind of help connect them to the causes they care about. What's your take here?
Yeah, I mean, I think just echo a lot of what Maria said. Honestly, it's such good stuff. I think trust that Maria had mentioned earlier really is one of the biggest concepts that nonprofits have to wrap their mind around. I think people are more generous than ever before. I mean, people want meaning. They want to be connected with impact. They want to make a dent in the world. And you see that in the world all around us. At the same time, I think folks have become a little less trusting of big institutions, right? And so they are uncomfortable just sending a check based on a pie graph on a direct mail appeal. And so as nonprofits, we have the responsibility to bring donors very close, shoulder to shoulder with us in the cause, and in confidence, both cast a vision for where we're going that they're excited about, but then also listen really, really well, right? And so find out what makes donors tick, not because you're going to shift your vision based on some feedback you get from a major donor, but because you want to understand how to plug each individual into your cause where they can make the biggest difference. And so, the easy part sometimes is on the major donor side, because you're getting to sit down with somebody and have coffee with them and ask them what they care about. I think that gets more difficult for nonprofits when you're talking about that $40 a month donor, right? Because Now it's how do we listen well at scale, and really understand what makes people tick across our entire file so we can create those kind of connections. But when we really lean in there, I think that's when we do build trust, and all of a sudden people don't see your nonprofit as a proxy for them doing good in the world. Instead, they see themselves as part of what you're doing, right? Shoulder to shoulder with you in the cause. And I think the successful nonprofits moving forward will really figure out how to broker that trust and pull donors in close.
Yeah, absolutely. And the one question we're asking over the next 2 days is this question about what's next. And so I wanted to get the panel's kind of thoughts here, starting with you, Kris, on how nonprofits should shift the conversation with donors in a post-pandemic environment. And then what must not change? What guidance do you have for donors in a post-pandemic? And then Maria, I would love to get your feedback after Kris.
Yeah, I would say the best way to shift is actually a mindset shift, and it starts with ourselves. I think, and again, I wrote about this in Delusional Altruism, that most of us in the nonprofit sector and philanthropy actually operate with a scarcity mindset. And what we need is an abundance mindset. Scarcity mindset, we don't invest enough in ourselves. Funders certainly don't invest enough in nonprofit organizations, as you all know. But we sort of expect that we can, live on a shoestring or kind of hamstring or cobble together our work. And, we deserve, with an abundance mindset is, you get out what you put into something, and we really need to invest in ourselves. But I think as for nonprofits, the mindset is also, really recognizing the value that you bring to the equation. I think too often there's this kind of assumption of, oh, I'm bothering the donor. I think we saw a lot of that at the beginning of the pandemic. I don't want to bother them or upset them, or, should I call? Maybe not. Or kind of seeing yourself, because, there is this power dynamic of they have the money and you want it, that, you're not a peer, but you are a peer. And in fact, you might be the most valuable part of the equation, because, the philanthropist cannot be philanthropic without you as the nonprofit organization, right? They have a mission maybe to end homelessness, but they're not the ones, building low-income housing, or they're not the ones providing job training or mental health services, right? They're relying on you, the nonprofit organization, to help them meet their mission. And so they need you. And I think, the mindset shift going into a conversation with a donor, or as you're creating your fundraising appeal, is, you're lucky to have us. We're here to provide value. We're giving you an opportunity to create change, to be generous, to give back, to make a difference. And we're going to make it easy for you by telling you exactly how to do that. Right. And so I do really think that's an important mindset shift that we need to think about, all the time, and especially going forward.
Maria?
Absolutely. I'm just, yes, plus oneing everything that Kris just said. Again, it's really about that mind shift, and I'm really having that growth mindset, right? I think that's been a thread of the conversation today. And I think it's really important that we're constantly looking at our own organizations and how we fundraise, how we engage donors. Again, one thing I think we can bring as fundraisers to funders is we're looking 10 steps ahead. We know what the economic shifts that may happen. We understand what's happening in local communities and what the challenges are. We're kind of the seers and clearing a path for funders, again, as educators, for funders to create that impact. So really taking the time to reflect, both within your own organization and how you can pivot, create efficiencies, better leverage technology, and how are you kind of looking 10 steps ahead, frankly, for the benefit of the communities you're serving as well as your funders. So I really think that if you're not leveraging technology, I think most people here are, obviously, who are at this conference, but that's creating so many efficiencies. Funders want to see that, particularly tech funders, that really resonates with them. Second, I would say, is how are you thinking about your revenue model for the long term? Yes, philanthropy is so important, and environments and communities like this are going to help you do that more efficiently. with Virtuous, but it's also how are you building technology? How are you acquiring other technology? So one of our clients, Beyond 12, they're a college mentoring platform for first generation college students. They've tripled their fundraising during COVID. So they are now big bettable because they were prepared. And we actually help them acquire another technology nonprofit so they save time and money in the long run to create their own earned revenue stream. So they're now selling their technology to institutions of higher education. So think differently about how can I efficiently raise philanthropy? We all have to engage funders virtually, whether you like it or not. Digital fundraising is never going to go away. So what's your strategy there? How can you be compelling? How can you bring your impact closer to the funder? And that's a huge opportunity. And second, how are you thinking about your long-term sustainability and how you achieve that through building technology, selling it, earned revenue opportunities?
Yeah, absolutely. I have to kick it over to you, Gabe. You're the technologist, true technologist in the room. You've been building software for a really long time. And obviously we here at Virtuous believe that it's platforms, people, and processes working together to help nonprofits connect their supporters to their story. Could you kind of double tap on that and share your perspective on how technology plays a role in growing generosity?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's obvious to everybody is the world is changing really fast, and doing everything manually at the pace that we've traditionally done stuff is just, it just doesn't cut it. It changes too fast. And so I think there's a few things there. One is that leveraging data to drive insights, both understanding who your donors are at scale. What do they care about? What do they do? What messages resonate with them the most? How do we communicate with them more quickly in real time, dynamically, instead of, waiting till the next month to give them an update on what we're up to, right? So using data to solve some of those challenges, particularly around communicating quickly. But I think on the program side too, some of the most innovative nonprofits that we've seen are actually using technology and data to drive more effective results and outcomes on the program side. So I think data is a big part of that story. I think marketing automation, so automating some of your processes, automating your communication so you have more time to do what you really want to do at your organization. And then I think the net of that is what it does is it brings donors in close, but it creates transparency, which is something that we've talked a lot about. I think the best nonprofits will be the ones that have a close enough relationships with their donors that they can be authentic and transparent in real time, and even admit failures when it happens. Like Maria says, not be beholden to, hey, we're 100% of your gift is going to go to this, and we're only going to work on it for a year, but instead say, hey, look, we have a 10-year strategy here. We're going to spend more than 5% of our budget on operations and capacity building because that's what it takes to advance our cause. And so, but I think you can't have those transparent conversations without a personal relationship first. And I think using data and technology well is the thing that empowers that sort of personal connection at scale.
I know this is maybe a broader conversation, but we can't talk about automation and technology around building relationships without asking the question like, wait, are we outsourcing relationships to computers or technology? How would you respond to that, Gabe?
No, it's a good question. We get it all the time. And no, because Nordstrom's always my thing because I get their emails every day. Because they know how to show me a picture of some guy in a shirt that I love because they know I'm going to click on it. That doesn't make it less personal. It makes it more personal. And number one, when you can automate that sort of personal connection and you don't use staff time to do it, it frees up your staff to do the relationship building they really want to do. When your staff isn't like pushing around spreadsheets all day and they have time to actually call people on the phone, that's a really, really good thing. So no, you're not outsourcing it. You're using technology to amplify those relationships and to grow them more quickly at scale.
Absolutely. We're coming up on our time, unfortunately. I wish we had more time with the three of you to dive into this, but I want to ask you for your questions. So we're asking the question, what's next over the next 2 days? There's a lot of elements or other questions that should be asked alongside that. So as you're thinking about, mostly nonprofit leaders, people that are responsible for raising money and raising support and funding for their missions, what questions would you encourage them to ask as they pursue the question of what's next for them? And I'll start with Maria.
Sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, so that we're asking people to ask the question, what's next? How should they move forward? How should they think about fundraising, fund engagement in 2021 and beyond? But as they pursue that question of what's next, what are some other questions they should be asking alongside that will help them answer that question in the long run?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, as we think about how the world is changing and we're more connected than ever, it's really thinking about, again, from our perspective, how are we as nonprofit organizations and funders, as we engage them, supporting the global majority, frankly. The world is changing, power is shifting. So again, from our perspective, knowing that only 8% of philanthropic dollars are supporting people of color-led organizations, these are often the communities that need our support the most. So it's really understanding how can we channel and uplift communities of color in our work.
Absolutely. And we really can't have a conversation about growing generosity without really acknowledging the gaps in our sector. So I appreciate you surfacing that and the work that Raises for Good's doing to be a part of that solution too. Kris, what advice would you have for those leaders listening into today's conversations and over the next 2 days?
Yeah, I'd really encourage two things. One is to reflect back on the past year. I mean, everyone, made some major changes, every organization listening in. So think back and bring your team together for maybe an hour or two brainstorm to say, what did we try last year that really worked well? What did we try that didn't work so well? What do we want to maintain? Like, what are these changes we want to maintain or even spread across our organization? So if we were able to fundraise faster, well, what else can we do faster in our organization or whatever it might be? And also, what did we, in retrospect, what do we wish we had done that we didn't, that we'd like to start doing now? And I would really encourage everyone, I think this is really important, to build upon the best practices and lessons learned in very practical ways, have that conversation, write it down, and then assign people to be accountable. Like, what are the most important things to focus on? And assign folks to be accountable to them and check in on that. Like, make a plan. In 2 weeks, we're going to check in on our progress on how we're going to be doing some of these things. And I'd like to echo what Gabe said at the beginning, which is, you're going to learn a lot in this conference, and it can be overwhelming. You can't operate on multiple fronts simultaneously. So pick, one or two things upon reflection at the end that you think are most important for you to work on and really move on them. And then once you get those tackled, then tackle other things. But there's a lot of, improvements and changes we can all make in 2021 and take advantage of what we learned in 2020.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kris.
And one more thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let's think about sustainability, right? For ourselves, we do this work day in and day out tirelessly. So as Kris mentioned, what's your plan for yourself on how you're going to make this work sustainable? We have a long road ahead of us. So again, think about and reflect on how you're going to take care of yourself so you can take care of others.
Maria, it's like you plugged our last session. So we're starting with generosity. Day 2 is going to end with resilience and talking about sustainability. So that's exactly what we totally agree with that. It's so important. We talk about how do you build systems and strategies that help you scale and build sustainability. So how do you make sure that works? That's right on. Gabe, I'll give you kind of the final word to wrap up this session on why generosity matters. What should leaders be thinking about as they pursue the question, what's next?
Yeah, I think asking the question, what has changed in the world that impacts my mission, right? So our mission shouldn't change, but sometimes changes happen in the world that impact our mission. So, a really basic example, if you work for a museum that was built 100 years ago, the mission of the museum is the same, right? But the tools you have available to draw people into that experience to accomplish that mission have completely changed in the last 100 years. And so it's really looking at the changes happening in the world, the macro environment around the economy, around justice, or around technology, and understanding how those fit into your mission, I think is a really important question to ask.
Well, thank you so much. Maria, I see your note, hire a consultant. I think that's a good call out. There is a lot of people out there that can help you answer these questions, and I think that's really important.